You get me, get you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, get you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, get you.
Hello, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Let's get right to it. I am so happy to be joined today by Daniel Weiner. Daniel Weiner serves as director of the Brennan Center's Elections and Government Program, where he leads work on money and politics, voting and elections, government ethics, and other democracy and rule of law issues. You may have seen him or read his contributions to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, on ABC or ABC News or NPR, many of the top respected outlets. Daniel previously served as senior counsel at the Federal Election Commission, where he assisted with managing the agency and advised the commissioner on a broad array of legal issues under federal campaign finance law, the Administrative Procedure Act, and the First Amendment. And before that, Daniel practiced law in the Washington office of Jenner and Block, where he litigated cases at the trial and appellate levels, counseled regulatory clients, and maintained an active pro bono practice focused on LGBTQ plus rights. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I really, it's so important what you're doing, and I'm just delighted to be here.
Oh man, it's a real thrill. I'm gonna, I'm not a lawyer. I only play one on podcasts, but
I'm
it's
not a podcaster. I only play one occasionally, when I go on
there
podcasts.
you
So
go, touche. But I was really curious. We'll talk about Brent. There's so much, not really much to talk about in the news these days. But no,
yeah.
I was actually curious. I thought a good way to start would be. I know you grew up in Minnesota. Is that right? And
I
then
did. I grew up first in Northfield, Minnesota. My parents were professors at a college called Carleton College, which is in southern Minnesota. And then later we moved to the Twin Cities. So I think of myself mostly as a native of St. Paul, Minnesota.
oh, okay, all right. And then at what point were you, did law become a calling for you? Was it pretty early on, or something you
It's
discovered in
No
undergrad,
one
or?
has ever asked me that in this context, but it's funny. So my dad was a historian, and I wanted to be a historian. And that's I went to college and I majored in history, and thought I would go be a professor. And my dad sat me down and said, "Hell no." Terrible idea. At the time I was gay and I was like, but I'd like to be a historian in New York City or maybe California. And he was like, how about some rural place where at the time, not so much now, maybe it wouldn't be so easy to be gay. And he said, how about law school? And I thought, well, I like to argue and I won't shut up. So sure, I'll give that a try. And so I went to law school and became a lawyer.
So yeah, I went to law school. By the way, Harvard Law. So by way of kind of charting with your trajectory, I mentioned Jenner and Block, but Harvard Law. So I'm going to read a summary from. I took this from the Guardian. In April, Harvard became the first and so far only university to sue the Trump administration over the funding cuts. It sued again the following month over the government's efforts to block the school from enrolling international students. The university has argued that the administration unlawfully slashed 2.6 billion in research funding from the university in retaliation for the school's refusal to comply with a series of demands laid out in an April 11th letter from a federal anti-Semitism task force. Those demands related to campus protests, academic policies, and admissions practices. So, as a graduate of Harvard Law, and someone who specializes in this very area of law, I'm curious what your thoughts are on what's happening now.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Look, I'm proud of the stand that Harvard has taken. I actually signed, along with thousands of other people, an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief in one of the lawsuits that they brought about academic freedom. It's interesting. When you look at authoritarianism, and I want to say that this notion that America is a democracy pure as driven snow and that we've never had any kind of authoritarian tendencies, I think is historically inaccurate, right? There's always been these competing impulses in American history, and we can talk more about that if you want. But when you look at what staves off authoritarianism, one thing is obviously free and fair elections, but another bulwark against authoritarianism is civil society, and which includes universities, includes nonprofits, includes the economy too, corporations. There, I think the big problem is collective action and is people worrying about taking a stand. And you see this play out with law firms, you see this play out with big companies. So I think it was very important for a university like Harvard to take a stand and to stand up to this assault. Well, taking responsibility for very real problems on the campus. I happen to be Jewish. I also, like many Americans, deeply concerned about the situation in the Middle East. But there were real issues that Harvard was having to confront. I will say that you know, we don't know how this is going to play out. They may end up making a deal with the administration. They may not. They may win in court. But I think for them to have even taken the stand was very important and very valuable.
So I'd like to make a distinction between the rhetorical or what could be considered popular, at least in some circles, arguments that the Trump administration is pursuing versus what's actually legal and what's actually ethical, and what comports with our Bill of Rights. Can you do you under hopefully you understand the distinction I'm trying to make, but I'd love for you, if so, I'd love for you to help clarify some of this for us. Like you use the word authoritarianism. I want to understand it better from at least a legal, if not an ethical and philosophical standpoint.
It's such a great question because, and we're going to talk a little bit about corruption today, and that is another word like authoritarian that sometimes gets thrown out in a way that it is unclear what people mean and can become sort of a synonym for just, well, I don't like this, so it's corrupt or it's authoritarian or what have you. Um, I think that it is legal and perfectly appropriate for any administration to enforce the laws we have in the books and to even conduct law enforcement in a way that is consistent with its policy objectives, which some of us might disagree with in some respects. I think what is clearly, in my book at least, authoritarian, right, is this kind of arbitrary deployment of power as a form of political payback. And really this idea that retribution is like literal retribution is an appropriate subject for appropriate locus of government policy. And I think it's hard to deny that you see that with Harvard, just based on the utterly disproportionate and other universities, the disproportionate measures they have taken relative to the problem that they are supposedly addressing. The idea that the opening of anti-Semitism on campus can be an excuse for just a wholesale culture war waged against these universities. I think that is when using those sorts of issues as a pretext is when you start to see what I think objectively can be called authoritarian tactics. Um, there's no one side that has a monopoly on this sort of thing. But I think that as often is the case under President Trump, you see tendencies that have long existed in American politics getting rapidly escalated. And that's what's happening with the universities. Critically, too, you mentioned the law. None of what they're doing in this context, or very little of what they're doing, not none of what they're doing, but very little of what they're doing is likely to be legal, right? It's so arbitrary, it is so disproportionate. And I do actually think this is one area where, because it is so extreme, the courts as we've seen so far, not going along with it. We'll see how this progresses. but it is as much about how actors like Harvard respond and whether they voluntarily comply, whether they take a stand and take risks to stand, to sort of transcend this kind of short-term thinking of, well, we just want to, get as much security as we can and as much advantage as we can for the moment. I would say this is true for many different sectors of our economy and society. The long-term interest that we all have in a stable economic and political system is sometimes at odds with maybe what we would see as our short-term advantage. And it's getting people to embrace that kind of long-term thinking that is really the challenge. And I do think Harvard did that. It is at least doing that for now.
Right, right. And another, I I have so many thoughts running in my head right now. I'm thinking of, I just spoke to someone who studied the Seven Mountain Mandate, which I don't know if you're familiar, but it is a philosophy of identifying the seven major institutions of our society and the mandate to basically take over for the new apostolic reformation, which is like
Uh-huh.
Christian nationalism on steroids. So, university system, the institution of education is one, but law is another one. And was Jenner and Block your first job out of law school?
No, Jenner and Block was my third job. I
Okay.
worked for a federal judge, and then I worked at another law firm, and then I came to Jenner and Block.
But I mean, the prevalent question for me is what are universities to do, or what are law firms to do when they find themselves under direct attack from the federal government? So, just to catch everyone up to speed, I'll read a summary from The Hill. This was from about a month ago. Jenner and Block was one of six law firms targeted by Trump. The firm previously employed Andrew Weissman, a prominent Trump critic and legal pundit who worked on former special counsel Robert Mueller's probe of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. The orders cut off employee security clearances and access to federal government facilities, while also directing the executive branch to review any contracts the government has with the firm, all in the name of addressing risks to the country. It was struck down. U.S. District Judge John Bates, an appointee of former President George W. Bush, slammed Trump's order against Jenner and Block as an effort to chill legal representation the administration doesn't like, in his ruling finding the directive unlawful. So I'm guessing, in answer to the question, what are law firms to do? What are universities to do? We can look at Jenner and Block or Harvard as examples of what they're to do.
Yeah, we certainly can, and I really want to emphasize, look, um, law firms are put in a difficult position because they're businesses,
Hmm.
and I've worked in law firms. Their first imperative often is to survive. But they are also led and staffed by lawyers who have ethical obligations to the profession and to the law that they need to be mindful of. Where I think that matters most is not so much what these law firms sort of notionally have or have not agreed to, but what they will be asked to do and what they will how they will conduct themselves given their ethical obligations. This is true for Jenner and Block, and this is the choice Jenner and Block made, but it's also true for the firms that supposedly cut deals with President Trump and now, are operating in a world in which they maybe have not suffered those consequences, but have agreed to do, what he calls pro bono work. It's going to be an ongoing set of choices that they have to make. And we broadly would say that everyone needs to conduct themselves according to their obligations as members of the bar and as members of the profession.
Right, right. So a little off topic, but how was your experience at Jenner and Block? Was it, I'm assuming it was a great learning experience earlier in your professional career.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a wonderful firm. I still have friends there. I think we have to remember that law in this country, and whether you like it or not, or whether you think it's the right choice, law is a business, and Jenner and Block, like every firm, is a business. I think that that's why when we think about this situation, we do have to remember these are profit-making businesses, and that's why they were created. Jenner is living by its values, which I think is is outstanding, and I want every law firm to do that. Really, frankly, regardless of whatever public pronouncements are made, and that is going to be an ongoing process. But I had a great time at Jenner and Block, and they still work. We still work with them, and they do a lot of great work, both for paying clients and pro bono clients.
And also a little bit more on the personal side, was it during that time that you began to zero in on your personal trajectory in the legal field? You know, I think it was from there you went on to work as senior counsel to the head of the federal election, the FEC. How did you begin to formulate where your own path and your own specialties that you were gonna focus in on?
That's such a great question. Yeah, at Jenner, Jenner has an election law practice. At the time, it was predominantly focused actually on gerrymandering and redistricting,
Mm. Not
and
much going on there.
not much going on there. So I did some very interesting work on that, representing clients in the redistricting process. I also did a little bit of work on, informing clients about developments in campaign finance law. I was actually at Jenner when Citizens United was decided. And I remember writing a short sort of alert for our clients on that. So it was actually, interestingly, for many people, their interest in election law and democracy was peaked in law school. For me, it was at Jenner that I really got most interested in the law of democracy specifically. And then there was an opportunity that came up at the Federal Election Commission that I took. And that sort of launched me on a trajectory of initially focusing mostly on campaign finance, but then increasingly on every aspect of the democratic process.
Okay, so I want to talk about the Brennan Center. There's plenty of topics there, and I want folks to understand the work of the Brennan Center. But you brought something up that I need to. I suspect we might have a difference of opinion on something that's happening right now, and I want to give you the opportunity to, if we do in fact disagree about it, I want to give you the opportunity to convince me why I'm wrong, and that is, I I've talked on a couple of recent episodes about my understanding of what Texas did in response to Trump's basically ordering them to redistrict mid-decade. From what I understand as a non-lawyer, is that that's technically legal, but putting it through the legal. Is it legal? Is it ethical? Is it wise lens? From an ethical standpoint, at the very least, it's dubious. Because mid-decade is breaking a norm. Not that it has never been done before, but it's breaking a very important norm. Is it wise? It's a whole separate thing. If you talk to some of the best political strategists, that's a whole other question. I think they might be dummy mandering more so than gerrymandering. But in California, if they do in fact put it up for a vote, I guess that would then make it technically legal. However, my feeling on it is the independent commissions that were put in place about 15 years ago here in this state created not a perfect system, but I felt that it was, as a scholar at Harvard would call it, an innovation to democracy, that was a step in the right direction, thus creating certain U.S. House districts like mine. California 27 is as purple as they come. In the 2020 election, it was decided by 300, less than 1/10 of 1% of the folks who came out. And as much as I am dubious, to say the least, of what Texas has done, especially in light of Trump's asserting his will, and them, snapping to attention and doing his will. I still, if that came up for vote, I would vote against it, because my concern is that a the independent commissions were a step in the right direction in terms of democratic innovation. And what they're doing now is diluting certain votes like mine. I'll be redistricted into California 26, and nothing against folks that are 30, 45, 60 miles away from me, but I'll be redistricted out away from my actual neighbors, let alone my friends who are in fact Trump supporters, and their voices who would want to vote for a Republican for U.S. House. So for that reason, even though it's not ideal, and I understand the impulse to want to fight back and gain 5 seats here in California, I think a step backwards in terms of democratic representation is not something that can be regained when things are in our favor. So tell me where I'm Tell me where I'm wrong and convince me
I'm
otherwise.
not going to try to persuade you one way or the other, and
Okay.
that's going to piss you off. I know. So
Okay. No, no, not at all.
here's what I'll say. Um, this is an inevitable consequence, in my view, of the failures of the Supreme Court and Congress, right? This is the quintessential problem that requires a national solution,
Mm,
right? Because the commissions in California and in other states, which we support and we continue to support, were always intended to be a proof of concept at the congressional level for a national solution, precisely because you run this risk of a kind of tit for tat or an arms race. How the US Supreme Court, I don't care what ideology they are, could have said, yes, this sort of extreme gerrymandering is really inconsistent with democratic principles as we understand them, but yeah, there's just nothing we can do about it. And then the US Congress, which has it within its power, everyone agrees, including the most conservative justices, to just prohibit this for the country, could have not done anything, is, I think, where people should train their outrage. This is what happens. I get asked the same question all the time also with campaign finance. Should politicians who say they want campaign finance reform forswear, working with super PACs or taking this or that kind of money? It's great when they do, but ultimately that's just not how politics works. People are in the political game to win. And this is why we want guardrails. This is why we need guardrails in our country. So I'm not going to try to persuade you one way or the other how to vote. What I'm going to say is that until you get national solutions to problems like gerrymandering, this sort of thing is what's going to happen.
I did take note, a paper that you wrote, gosh, it's 8 or 9 years ago. You were making recommendations that are parallel, align with what you're saying right now, but it had to do a lot to do with Congress passing legislation, Congress passing laws. In this case, it had to do with ethics law. So close the presidential loophole,
Yeah.
expand the scope of financial disclosure.
I didn't think that would still be relevant. I don't know. I guess it's kind of
Well,
it's paper.
no, 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 it's very relevant. But the only
Uh-huh.
reason it might be less relevant is I wonder if the idea of Congress actually passing laws, if that's a horse that's left the barn.
Well, I mean, that's the problem. It's a horse that has to, well, I'm going to mess up that metaphor, so I'm not even going
Okay.
to.
Feel free to mix metaphors.
Congress is not doing its job right now.
Yeah.
Congress was intended to be the first branch of government. Congress was intended, among other things, to obviously make our laws, and that includes setting standards for everyone in government. The only pure sort of ethics provisions, if you want to call them that are written into the Constitution are the emoluments clauses, right? The foreign and domestic emoluments clauses
Which are
that
working great right now.
yeah, which are working great, which were specifically vested in Congress,
Yeah.
right, to enforce. So the fact that Congress, we don't really have another option other than for Congress to start doing its job again. And that includes, I think, setting some basic ethical guardrails for the president and the vice president. Frankly, it also includes Congress setting better ethical guardrails for itself.
Mm,
They need to, for instance, crack down on this practice of stock trading by members of Congress based on inside information, right? Which is something that happens on both sides of the aisle. So Congress has to do that. There isn't really another path other than to have Congress be legislating again. Even if you want to say we're going to amend the Constitution or something, still at the end of the day, Congress is the body that makes the laws for the country. And I absolutely think we need to figure out how it can get back to doing that.
yeah.
And that includes figuring out some basic ground rules that, Republicans and Democrats in Congress can agree on. Stock trading may be one of them, actually, is that you see some momentum on both sides of the aisle to actually pull that back some because both Democrats and Republicans, at the very least, are concerned about Congress's public perception and the confidence that the public has in them, which frankly is quite low right now.
Yeah. Now, I know Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization, but I'm wondering if you see any emerging leaders, whether they be Republican or Democrat or independent, that in a fantasy world would be elected to the highest office of the land and then lead a movement lead efforts to restrain the power of that very office. Is that just beyond reasonable, realistic expectations?
Well, so it is my one cardinal rule in my job that I don't advocate for candidates or prospective candidates because we are a nonprofit.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to give you names. And again, I'm sorry if
No, that's okay.
you're never going to have me on your podcast again.
No, no, no.
But
I totally will. This is a
I,
fascinating
but here,
conversation.
here's what I will say. I think that that is the fundamental one of no one of the fundamental mistakes that I have seen from administrations of both parties in my adult lifetime is kind of this assumption that um, they are always going to be in charge, and whatever prerogative or advantage that they have sort of clawed their way into needs to be zealously guarded. Candidly, I think that was a problem after the first Trump administration, is that Democrats, and they try, some Democrats tried. I want to be very clear about that. But, there was a lot of discussion about democracy and abuse of power and excess. And then very little happened to actually rein in presidential power and put some checks, real checks back on it when Democrats were in charge. And again, Democrats in Congress actually did pass legislation to do that, but it didn't pass the Senate. And frankly didn't have, as far as I could tell, the full-throated support of the Biden administration.
Mm,
So I do think whoever comes next, Democrat, Republican, is going to need to realize that we need to think of the presidency as an institution that is sometimes going to be in the hands of people you maybe don't like very much and that you don't trust. And the basis of a functioning democracy is that we can live comfortably sometimes under the rule of people who we have very, very, very profound disagreements with. And that's, I think, partly something that we've gotten away from. And it does mean that everyone, and me too, needs to think about, are there times when we have sort of looked to quick fixes and, executive power in a way that wasn't necessarily healthy for the long-term stability of our
yeah.
democracy.
Yeah, and this is all the project of democracy in a pluralistic society.
Right.
Hearing how you think, I can understand how the Brennan Center would be a dream job for you. So, with that, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about the Brennan Center and
Sure.
specifically more about your job there.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just would encourage everyone to go to our website too, www.brennancenter.org. And when you're there, sign up for our newsletters, which I know that sounds lame. They're actually really good and fun. And our president, Michael Waldman, writes a lot of them. He's a fantastic writer. So they're actually really good. It's like a little slice of the Atlantic coming into your inbox. I don't know if I might get in trouble for
No,
saying
no, 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 not actually.
that.
I've been reading them. They're very palatable, even for
Yeah.
non-lawyers like me.
Yeah,
So,
so I that's my little plug. But we are a nonpartisan law and policy institute that focuses, around issues of democracy and justice. I would say we're probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest, um, think tank and scholarly and advocacy institutes that is really focused in significant part on democracy issues. We were founded to honor the memory of Justice William Brennan, who was a leading light of the Warren Court, but not necessarily to just sort of by rote further all of the positions and opinions he had when he was active in American government. And actually, one of our first and central issues, money in politics, was structured around repudiating a Supreme Court decision he wrote called Buckley v. Valeo, which is the original reason why we don't have effective campaign finance regulation. We are based and we're affiliated with NYU School of Law. We're based in New York, although we also have an office in Washington, D.C. I am director of the Elections and Government program, and my program focuses, it sort of has two focuses. One is on kind of the integrity of government, campaign finance, rule of law, ethics, And then the other focus is on the machinery of actual elections, election administration. So making sure that our elections are free, fair, and critically secure. And increasingly, a lot of my work and our program's work also deals with sort of the effects of new technology on the political process. I've done a lot of work on AI and elections, both the dangers it poses, but also opportunities for better election administration. A lot of work on social media. So we really see ourselves as trying to come up with solutions to deal with the problems of today. And in fact, I think a lot of our challenges right now in our democracy are that, again, partly because Congress has not been doing its job, are both our laws and our unwritten rules and norms are need to be updated to meet the sort of contemporary challenges we're facing. And that's the work of my career. And I'll leave you to judge how well it's going right now, but that's certainly what I aspire to.
So this is a focus of mine. I'm curious how worried you are about the integrity of the 2026 and 2028 elections.
I think you'd be crazy not to be worried about it. I mean, I think, and again, I want to say this in, a nonpartisan way, but some of the things we are seeing out of this administration, we actually have some recent publications on this, are unprecedented and scary. To have the president adopting misinformation, to have threats to prosecute election officials. I mean, we talk a lot about Project 2025. I think one of the most astonishing passages from that, and it got not enough attention, was a literal threat to prosecute the Pennsylvania Secretary of State for election practices during COVID that were blessed by the Pennsylvania courts. You can disagree with those decisions. You can say that they should be barred by future law, but to threaten to prosecute someone. So I think it's incredibly concerning. That being said, I think one of the great strengths of our system, right, is we are a federal system. I actually think there should be more uniform rules that for conducting federal elections, but still states run elections. No one has ever suggested otherwise. And I think, that is it can create complications, but it's also a great strength. And I think the overwhelming majority of the election officials who are running our elections are dedicated public servants who are really, really faithful to the rule of law. So what I would say to anyone who's worried right now is what we absolutely need to do is have their backs. We need to make sure that they have the tools to do their jobs. I think another thing that's a concern, frankly, is the withdrawal of federal support for election security. There's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Information Agency. I think the shorthand is CISA. It's a part of the Department of Homeland Security. The Trump administration has gutted its budget and pulled it back from a lot of the work it did to support election officials. That is very, very worrisome. But people are going to need to step into the gap to help them do their jobs and then to have their backs if they come under political or legal attack for doing their jobs. If we do that, then I think we are going to continue to have free, fair, and hopefully secure elections. It just doesn't happen magically. It's a lot of work. And the question is, are we going to muster the energy and determination to do that? And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we will, but I don't think you can take it for granted.
Yeah, I start to get concerned when we talk about national solutions, especially with an administration with the impulses that this one has, um, because to your point, I guess the best reason to be optimistic is that we indeed have 50 separate elections as opposed to one federal election. But when national solutions can bleed um, into a dangerous zone, I guess, because look, a couple of verticals that I don't hear a lot of folks putting together right now is as Trump has deployed federal troops in Los Angeles, well, actually National Guard troops initially in Los Angeles, and then Marines in Los Angeles, and now in D.C., and is threatening to take similar actions, have armed troops in the city, in Chicago and other blue cities around the country. I that's a vertical that when I put it together with my concerns about the integrity of the next the 2026 and 2028 elections, that gives me that keeps me up at night. Am I being hyperbolic? Am I being do I need therapy? Like tell me.
Well, in the nut, I'll say this, you have every right to be concerned. I think that maybe you're oversimplifying a little bit.
Okay.
So when I talk about national solutions, I don't mean executive fiat based on the whims of the president, which is what that is.
Okay.
I mean certain baseline national standards written into law by Congress as intended in the Constitution. The Constitution explicitly says Congress can write rules for federal elections duly passed through the legislative process. That's what we've advocated, and the kinds of national solutions we've advocated for, things like giving people an opportunity to vote early, because voting on election day only, limiting voting to election day, disenfranchises people because it's like one Tuesday, sometimes only during business hours. If you don't work a conventional white collar job where you can step away from the office. And maybe even if you do, you might not be able to vote during that time. So we've advocated for things like early voting. And we think that that should be, something that all states offer. A ban on extreme partisan gerrymandering, that is a national solution. So uniform, easy to understand laws duly passed by Congress are one thing. Arbitrary executive actions and or laws, or executive actions based on utter misinformation, that's different. My objection to the show your papers requirements, this idea that you need to show proof of citizenship for voting. One is that is absolutely not something the president has authority to just impose on the states. But two is that it's based on this idea that large numbers of non-citizens are voting or registered, and we just know that that's not true. So it is incredibly burdensome. It could disenfranchise tens of millions of people. And at the same time, it's going after a problem that is not a major problem. But that's a debate that we can have and that they can have in the halls of Congress, right? So the baseline just is whatever you think about it, the president just can't order things to happen and then take control of federal elections. That's antithetical to our history and the Constitution is written. And then when you actually get into what sort of national solutions should we have, it's always a balance. We already have national solutions. The National Voter Registration Act does impose certain requirements for registering to vote in federal elections the states have to adhere to, which is, you have to prove your identity when you register to vote for the first time. And that's appropriate. And we think there should be more national standards. But again, it's a balance. What we have never argued for, and what I don't know anyone seriously wants, is what they actually do have in many other countries, which is actually like national election administration, like federal elections in the hands of a federal agency that runs them, essentially. That I don't advocate for. It is actually fairly common around the world, but there are advantages to the way we do in such a big, diverse country where different regions have different needs. But I do think it would actually help with a lot of our issues to at least have some greater national standards so that you don't have so much variation across the country in how states do things. So for instance, the example I'd like to cite, in some states, mail ballots come in and they're not formally counted, but they're processed as they come in. And so we know those totals, they're not released, but then on election night, you can more swiftly get a result. In other states, legislatures have refused to change the rules, so they basically just sit there and they'd only start counting them on the night of election night. And then is when you get, the returns take several days to be tabulated. It would be nice, I think, for mail voting. I think mail voting is something that we should have as an option for people. It would be nice, though, if we had some uniform rules on how you count mail ballots so that we have some uniform expectations on when you're likely to know what those mail ballots are telling you about the result of the election.
So we don't have a 2025 version of the hanging Chad problem.
Yeah, or just a 2025 version of why did this state have its results an hour after polls closed and this
Right.
other one didn't have its results for 3 days.
Yeah, that was the context, and it was a vacuum within which Trump was able and Trump's lackeys were able to make arguments about,
Right.
mysterious votes changing overnight in Arizona and Maricopa County and Pennsylvania.
I just
So
want to say one other thing about
yeah,
that in the spirit of this podcast, though. The national solutions doesn't mean that there'll all be things that I like. Like I am perfectly open, on various issues to the idea that some national standards may be standards I wouldn't have implemented. But I do hope, at least, that the national standards that we do pass are based on like observable, objective issues. And come from the starting point that we want everyone who is eligible to vote to be able to cast a ballot and have a
right.
reasonable opportunity to do so. And in that case, we can disagree about how to do that. We can disagree about the balance between voting access and security. Those are all fair game. And in a big, complicated country, you're going to have some disagreements, and there's going to be some variation among the states.
Yeah. So teasing this out a little bit further for folks that for regular folks on the ground, for civilians, everyday voters, or just folks that are part of the what I think of as the extended pro-democracy coalition, what can we do to whether it's just supporting our state and local election officials, or what other actions can we take to resist the tendencies that we see the direction of this administration going, where I really like the concerns about the integrity of the next elections, where we can be part of the solution, we can be part of the bulwark.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I really encourage everyone to consider, particularly, particularly if you live in an area that has experienced shortages in the past, is consider volunteering to be a poll worker, and to actually help run the election. We don't have enough people who agree to do that. It can feel sort of thankless. It is a really, really, really important service, and you have people listening from all over the country. Whatever your political persuasion, I think that that is incredibly important. And then I also think, frankly, making clear to your representatives that you care about these issues. I mean, part of the problem, and I am a little bit frustrated here. I hear now um, Republicans from Democratic controlled states, including California, are very alarmed now about this sort of tit for tat gerrymandering. And I understand the critique that, the Democrats, when they wanted to prohibit partisan gerrymandering nationally, put it into a package with other things that maybe Republicans didn't want to pass. What I'm not aware of, maybe I missed it, is that there was any serious effort on the Republican side to come back, driven maybe by these blue state Republicans to say, okay, we don't want to do this other stuff, but you know what? We will work with you to pass a nationwide ban on gerrymandering. I'm not aware that any serious effort that happened. Now you're getting bills, people are offering bills and stuff like that. But part of that is, I think, a signal of what constituents care about. And I think constituents, particularly, frankly, your listeners and your viewers who live in districts represented by people who haven't prioritized democracy issues, making it clear to them that you really expect them to make this central to their governing priorities is important. We are maybe seeing a little bit of that again with congressional stock trading, where voters have made clear to representative of both parties, some of whom quite candidly maybe don't want to do
Yeah.
limit this, that they want to see this happen. One other thing I'll say, and this is you know worth thinking about, is to keep an open mind. There are solutions and there are ways of moving forward on some of our most troubling issues that might be counterintuitive. The example I give to people sometimes actually is congressional pay. People are, I hear all the time, Congress is so corrupt. Congress, isn't doing its job. It's such a mess. How we need to throw them all out. You might also consider whether, one way to make Congress function better would actually be to finally raise their pay for the first time in a decade. They make a decent salary, but I think regular members of Congress make $174,000 a year. Upper middle class salary. They're not complaining, but frankly, it hasn't been raised in over a decade, as I understand it. And if you're asking someone from California to fly back and forth across the country, live in their district, also maintain a residence in DC, and then paying them basically what less than a junior associate at a big law firm makes, you're potentially risking that, either they're not going to want to stay in their job very long, or that they're going to be under a lot of financial stress while they're doing it, or that the only people who are going to be interested are people who have large amounts of family wealth and are completely disconnected, or other wealth and completely disconnected from the concerns of ordinary Americans. So some of the solutions to our problems may not be the things that we think are the most obvious answers, and may even be a little bit counterintuitive. And I hope people will sort of think creatively about some of these issues.
It's a really good point. A couple of my best friends are attorneys, who I think would make great elected officials. And in both instances, I got to the point of saying, well, why don't you run for U.S. House? Why don't you run for mayor? Why don't you run for any And the answer is, I can't afford it.
Right.
It's just a reality. I'm curious too. We're talking about what regular folks like me can do about it. Regular voters, concerned citizens, just concerned, neighbors in communities all over the country can do about it. But what about at the elected officials at that level, whether it's chief executives in states, governors, or other local officials? I've been asking about this, and maybe I'm just thinking about it wrong, that we're seeing the Trump administration threatening the balance of power, basically making a mockery of legislative and in some cases ignoring judicial rulings. But what about the vertical balance of power? So when you look at federal, state, and local, what other we're seeing governors like Governor Pritzker and Governor Newsom here in my home state make pretty bold speeches. In Newsom's case, he's taking this action with trying to get the redistricting passed. So that's an aggressive move. What other actions can governors take to push back on the vertical balance of power to get our constitutional order, get some equilibrium back in place? Does it make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, one of the things that obviously we really want governors and other state officials to take is to support election officials.
Hmm.
So the biggest and most important thing that I think they can do is when we have the midterms, is for governors to insist that the folks running elections in their states follow the law, and to have their backs when they do that. And that's governors, it's secretaries of state, it's attorneys general. States conduct elections in this country. They have to obey federal rules, but primarily those elections are governed by state law, and states have every right to insist that their laws, provided they're constitutional, obviously, are adhered to. I think that certainly, and we certainly have seen some of this is, Republican officials, particularly, even people who agree with the president on other issues, need to also, take that obligation seriously. I think that you have seen some pushback, and certainly, in 2020 and in, the lead up to January 6th, which was terrible, you did see plenty of Republican officials say, I voted for you, I support you, I endorse you, but no, what you're asking me to do right now is against the law, and I'm not doing it. And I hope that we will see some of that same behavior, either publicly or behind the scenes. And then the last thing I think is, we do need all of our elected officials to model at least some grace for the other side. I mean, this is the thing, right? That you know, again, without opining on what's happening in California, I don't have a strong view on that. Gavin Newsom has at least acknowledged that this is not ideally the ideal of how things should happen. And what he's proposing is he would say temporary. Whether you think that's acceptable or worth voting for or not, there isn't at least an acknowledgement on his part that this is not ideally, the state owes its Republican voters more. I wish you saw that in Texas, frankly, because I think that this idea that, your only job is to represent the 51 or 55% of the voters that are in the majority is very destructive to our democracy. And I do think, at least initially you are seeing Republican representatives in some states where they may be being pressured to gerrymander, making those arguments. The question is whether it's going to be enough.
Yeah. Now, but as far as so Governor Pritzker, I forget it was yesterday, the day before, as we're recording this, made a pretty bold speech about the prospect of federal troops in the streets of Chicago. There's really it, other than suing, a legal battle. There's really not much a governor can do, is there?
No, although and again, I have other colleagues who have a lot of expertise on these issues, and who've spoken. My colleague Liza Goitein, I encourage folks to find her on social media and take a look at what she's written and said about this. But it is so blatantly illegal what he is proposing, and I think it's right for the governor and for others to hold him accountable. I think at the same time, I appreciate trying, efforts to prevent from escalating these situations, right? And it's a very difficult line to walk. But I think suing and making clear that this is not legal and that it's also not responsible is exactly what they need to do. But it's very hard, and I think you just need to acknowledge it's very hard to mount a kind of institutionalist defense to, blatant norm breaking and in some cases law breaking. And this has been a challenge for public officials, really for centuries, right? Is how do you reinforce respect for the rule of law in the face of actions that seem to not really be taking the law into account. And that's very difficult. But I really think, again, what I would hope is that all voters, and you certainly are seeing some of this in the polls, including people who may like other things that the president is doing, would recognize that this is absurd and ridiculous and destructive.
Yeah.
And I think we have seen, there's no great love for the public of Washington, D.C., but we have seen, for instance, that the deployment in D.C. is very unpopular, right?
Mhm.
And I would hope actually that even elected officials who support the president would be looking at that and looking to use their influence to rein that in,
Yeah.
because I don't think this is what the public elected Donald Trump to do. And these kinds of displays, I think, ultimately are not going to benefit any of us.
Yeah, I could speak to that. And this is just from personal experience. It's not a scientific survey, but about a week ago, I was at a dinner with five of us all together, at least three of whom voted for Trump. And all three had specific top line reasons that influenced their vote. One had to do with immigration, one had to do with crime, one had to do with the economy. And all three said the same thing, that they voted for a reason, but the way the administration is executing what they voted for is not what they voted for.
Right.
So these extreme actions, whether it's federal troops on the streets or alligator Alcatraz or the shenanigans he's playing with tariffs on the economy, that's not what they voted for. So there's at least a percentage of folks who did end up voting that way in the last election that are now at least very seriously questioning their votes. There is something I realize I've been asking you certain things that are at least adjacent to your purview and your expertise. So I appreciate you
This is the
bearing with
most
me.
fun when I can opine on things that are, I don't, I'm, it's more interesting that way.
Oh, good, good. That's just so I feel like I'm at the bar with just guys who really don't know anything about it but have really strong opinions anyway.
Just
No, I'm just
enough
kidding.
opinions to be dangerous.
Well,
Yeah.
actually, maybe this is something you could speak to. I start my first job when I was a kid, basically, was as a stockbroker. So I still track, I still track the Fed, if nothing else, as an interested observer. The president is trying to fire, I don't know if it's official or what status it's in, a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Lisa Cook. Now, I realize that she's suing because she's still, I think she'd be in place under her term until 2038. And Ms. Cook is suing because she can only be fired for cause, and that hasn't been established by any reasonable means. But my question for you is, what sort of dangers does this pose, whether it's to our legal system, our banking system, our monetary policy, or the economy as a whole, in your view?
Well, it's terrifying. Like the integrity of the Fed, I think rightly people perceive as incredibly important to the stability of our economy. I actually think the thinly veiled racism of the attacks on her is also really dispiriting, right? Whether you supported her appointment or not, right? This kind of targeting is gross, to be blunt. Um, I guess my view of it is, though, is that the irresponsible actions of other institutions set the stage for this. Like, you can't just pretend that this came out of nowhere. It has been the law of the land for almost a century that Congress can establish, independent agencies within the executive branch that, while they are under the president's supervision, are also insulated from his control. And that's how you run a modern, complex government. It's not that it's perfect, but it is how we and most countries have done things. The courts, so the Supreme Court, have already let him walk all over those restrictions, based on this notion of what's called a unitary executive theory, which is the idea that not only does the president broadly run the executive branch, but he has to have minute control over every aspect of its operations, right? Um, that is a very destructive theory. While they are not technically invoking that in this instance, the reason that they are pushing the envelope is because of all the signals the courts have sent him that they're going to be very, very permissive. And I guess when I say courts, I really mean the Supreme Court. So it makes me tremendously angry because it took a lot of moves to get us to this point.
Mhm.
And this is this idea that we talked about Congress, we talked about the president, but the Supreme Court um, is seemingly trying to impose this, highly ideological, incredibly simplistic notion of how government should operate, straight out of, an imagined idea of what the government looked like in the early 19th century. And at the same time, building the president up to this kind of monarchical power that would have horrified our actual framers,
Yeah.
right? Who actually did not want the president to do exactly this. And so to me, it's just incredibly harmful. And I'm certainly, obviously, as anyone who has a 401k, I'm really, really worried about any attack on the Fed. And which is not to say that I love the Fed, but it is an incredibly important component of our economy. But I'm also really, really, really frustrated by all the steps that have led up to this, and that I think created a bit of a permission structure for them to be trying this. We'll see. Maybe this will be the Supreme Court's red line, right? Because they have retirement accounts too. And they've said publicly that they view the Fed as different. But it didn't have to happen this way. And if there had been more guardrails earlier, we might not be in this position.
Mm. Yeah, I guess we could have a whole other hour just on the other types of corruption. That this is indicative of the other types of corruption that we might
And
see.
I want to say to your Trump voting, listeners, like, you can like what he's done on many things. You can have voted for him. I voted for whoever I voted for, and still think he probably shouldn't have unlimited, unbridled power
Right.
to, go after one of the central institutions of our economy for what appears to be sort of short-term political gain.
Yeah.
I have a window into his soul, but I think, most people would say, either publicly or privately, this sort of attack on the Fed is incredibly ill-advised.
I have to go back and because there was a case, I forget it was last year or the year before, at the Supreme Court, where the unitary executive theory was addressed. And not that it was repudiated, but it was restrained in that case. I want to say it was a case out of North Carolina. I'm foggy on the details right now,
No,
but
there
I
have been a
was
couple of them. Yeah.
there've been a couple where it was addressed, and it was at least it in one instance, if I remember correctly, it was punted back down, and the court, as so often has done over the last few years, to say, Congress, do your job, pass the legislation, or it was punted back down to a lower court. But in this instance, I just have to go back and look it up, and I might do a follow up on this.
Well,
to
a lot of what's happening too, right, is they haven't even actually fully implemented the unitary executive theory. What they're doing is using something called the shadow docket, which is
oh,
basically their rulings on emergency motions to
right.
send these sort of smoke signals of what they're maybe going to do,
Yeah.
which is actually an additional problem because they're not even explaining themselves. They've allowed the firings of the heads of independent agencies to go forward. So they're sending a signal of where they probably are going to land, but they're not actually issuing a decision, a formal decision yet. So in some ways, it's the worst of both worlds, right? They're like allowing this to happen, but they're not even explaining themselves fully.
So it's like Supreme Court haiku, and we're left to
Right.
figure out the
Or a
rest.
Supreme Court, right, like shadow boxing, whatever.
Yeah.
Bad metaphor, but
I love it. So I want to start to wrap it up. This is what we call the TP&R question, talk politics and religion without killing each other question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, and perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So that's people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
well, I think here's what I think is that you have to start by realizing that people who have very fundamental disagreements have to coexist in society. And I'll give you an example. I was giving a speech a couple weeks ago about threats to democracy, because that's what I talk about these days. And someone asked me after it, someone came up and said, I'm really surprised you didn't say Christian nationalism was a threat to democracy. And my response to that was that, well, it depends on how you define Christian nationalism. Because if you define Christian nationalism as someone who thinks that a biblical worldview should be the basis of law, and they are going to use democratic processes to try to push for their viewpoint, I may really fundamentally disagree with them. I'm an out gay man, I'm married, I have a family. This is existentially important to me, but they have the right to their views just like I have the right to mine. And so I am not going to say that someone who just happens to have diametrically opposed views in that way is a quote threat to democracy. So we have to accord, I think, people who have these very strong differences of opinion the respect that we want, which is that they have the right to engage the political process. Where this person, I think, is a threat to democracy is if they actually think that the democratic institutions on which our country is founded should be replaced by some sort of theocracy. But that is not what everyone, certainly who gets labeled a Christian nationalist, actually thinks or wants. And I think we need to be very careful. And there is a tendency, I think, on the progressive side to start to try to label everything as a democracy issue, right? Which it's in good faith, but it's not very helpful because, again, it doesn't really lend itself to pluralism. And it makes it harder then to talk about things that are real threats to democracy.
Yeah. If everything is apocalyptic, then nothing is apocalyptic.
And
Um,
if everything is fundamentally like you can't disagree unless you're completely beyond, if you disagree, you're completely on the pale and actually we don't even really belong in the same society, then we're not
right.
going to.
Yeah. It happens to me all the time. Um, by the way, I think your mic might have just gone out.
Oh,
Oh, there you go. Okay, got it.
oh, sorry.
No problems. All right. So, as nervous as this makes me to ask a well-trained, well-accomplished lawyer, both in the courtroom as well as in academia, do you have any questions for me?
Sure. And I'm sorry, my alerts are suddenly dinging here and it's driving me nuts. So I apologize.
That's okay.
My question for you is, what do you think people like me who are trying to advocate for democratic principles could do better, recognizing that we're all human. And of course, we come into this with our priors, such that I can't pretend that I don't have, political views or preferences. But what could I, given that I'm a human being, what could I be doing better to get that sort of broad buy-in from even people who might disagree with me, might disagree with the Brennan Center?
Yeah. So that's an important query. That is an important. There's a better word for that. Inquiry. That's a better word. The It's an important inquiry as long as we're willing to reckon with the real answers and carry out the real answers. One, I don't know you well enough to know how much you're doing the following or not.
And people like me. Let's just I'm not going to take it personally. Don't
Sure.
worry.
So one is I think we all need to make an effort to sit with people who we know have differences than we do and to practice, as opposed to practicing contentious engagements, contentious conversations, and rehearsing them in our head before we even sit down for the coffee or the beer or the lunch or the post soccer game, uh, diner visit, to rehearse leading up to those situations the art of seeing, the art of asking the kinds of questions that open someone else, that person that you disagree with, to their own humanity, to their own stories, to be able to see how they arrived at the decision to check a different box than you did on the top of the ticket in the last election. So that's one way. But I think your position, not you in particular necessarily, but at least in your position, another way to do it is to do the work of translation. A lot of times, and I do this too, where I start to get lost in the weeds. I start to geek out on different issues, and if I learn about an issue, I start going beyond the palette of a lot of people that I'm engaged in interesting conversations with, and I lose them. But if you can, the art of taking really important concepts, even being able to translate the First Amendment. If you were to read the First Amendment, it might as well be written in Shakespeare or another language altogether. It goes. Not that a lot of people are dumb. It's just written at a different 250 years ago plus now. So actually, 1786. So it wasn't 200. Anyway, you know what I
No,
mean.
no, where the Declaration of Independence is turning.
The Declaration will be 250 next year.
Yeah.
So, but to do the work of translation, I had a great theologian say he's one of the smartest people in the country, and his academic works, man, I had to have a dictionary by my side, every other sentence. There were not just words, but entire concepts that I just had to sit with for a long time. But he had this other way of distilling it so that people like me who aren't theologians could understand it. Because he said at the end of the day, the work of a theologian, the work of a minister, the work of somebody who's going to shul or church or the mosque or doesn't go to church at all is still, you need to sit with that person when his grandmama's in the hospital. And I think
Mhm.
that so we all have to, whatever our expertise is, however advanced we are in our expertise, at the end of the day, we still have to sit with our friend and our neighbor at the diner or when his grandma's in the hospital. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I wonder also whether sometimes we need to ask more questions.
That's it.
At this same speech that I was giving, I'm just thinking a guy came up afterwards and he said something like, Brennan Center should stop calling yourselves nonpartisan. You're clearly partisan. And we're really not, right? We have a set of beliefs and we don't pretend that those are neutral beliefs, but they are not based on who we want to get elected. And so I started to get into that spiel. But what I regret in retrospect is that I didn't ask him, why do you think that?
Right.
I started to give him my spiel of like why we're not. And I feel it that way. But I realized I missed an opportunity because he was a nice guy and he shook my hand and said, thank you for coming. And, that I really should have taken the opportunity to ask him, well, why would you say that? Like you can understand why we have a viewpoint. Why do you think we're partisan? So that's a good point.
But I just want to encourage you
Yeah,
about that we learn more from our relative losses than we do from our wins. So a batter that goes and gets his home run or even just a really solid single, he's going to celebrate it, but he's going to learn a lot more from his cold streaks. And even Hall of Famers only get their hit 3 out of 10 times, plus or minus, right? So we learn a lot more from the 7 out of 10 times that we lose because it's going to equip you. You're going to remember that going into the next conversation, so that you do ask, "Oh, that's interesting. Why do you say that?" Yeah,
Mhm.
you want to go grab a coffee? Let's talk about that some more. I'd love to learn about how you arrived at that. It allows us to move forward from there. So, two more questions. Well, one piece of business and then
Sure.
one question. Sorry, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, so no, no, no. Go ahead. So, do you want me to ask you a question, or do you have another question for
Oh, you
me?
have more questions? Oh shit. Okay.
No, I can keep going because I
Okay.
actually would like to know what issues right now you think are the most important for all of us to be paying attention to.
So this show is a reflection of what I think. It's not an issue per se, but the program is a reflection of what I think is the most important because the project of democracy requires us to share space with and do democracy with people that we have differences with. And I noticed that not only do we not understand folks, we don't we don't know how to talk to. We don't even know how to talk about people that have
Yeah.
differences in certain areas. I mean, you could look at the way when John McCain picked Sarah Palin as his running mate. Um, I realized that she was talking about people. I grew up in a Jewish family. I became a Christian in my late 20s. Politically, most of my family you would consider pretty, not far left, but at least moderately, if not far left. So even though I'm more of a Alex P. Keaton type conservative, if you know the reference.
Oh, I'm in my 40s. Of course I do.
Okay, good. So I'm more of a Alex P. Keaton or Buckleyan conservative, I guess is a better way to put it. But I she was talking about people I love, but she was not talking about them in any way accurately. So that I think is the transcendent issue. But in terms of actual issues, what we're talking about in terms of democracy, that's at
Yeah.
the top. That's at the very top.
I'm mindful the one thing we didn't talk about really at all right now is social media. And I've seen some studies that show that the conventional wisdom for a long time was social media shows you things that confirm your biases. It's like a closed bubble. But I think that there's some interesting new research. Social media also, because negative emotions actually are just as likely to get engagement, social media tends to also show you the other side in its most unflattering light.
Mm,
So it doesn't show you the reasonable articulation of the other side's view. It shows you, pardon my language, the batshit version
yeah,
of the other side's view because that's what's going to keep your eyeballs on it. And it is actually, as someone who lurks a lot on social media, it's something I struggle with, right?
yeah.
It's because I think I go through life sometimes with a distorted view of what other people think. And I've been trying to think of ways to transcend that a little bit.
Well, we all have agency, so we can
Yeah.
read. If I'm right
True.
of center, I can read E.J. Dionne, who articulates right of center arguments in a really full, nuanced way. I can read Yasha Monk, who engages with people actually to the left of him on issues of identitarianism. I can read, or Thomas Chatterton Williams just had his book come out, and he articulates arguments that he disagrees with in a
I'm a big fan of his. I have a subscription to the National Review, although who knows, I find myself agreeing with them on a lot of issues these
No,
days.
it's important. And but also if you hear intelligent arguments from folks that you disagree with, sometimes you do find that, oh wow, that actually makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. But at the very least, it equips you that much better to engage with the best representatives from different viewpoints. So yeah, I guess we could do this all day. We're going a
Yeah.
little bit longer than I anticipated. Before I forget though, you did mention BrennanCenter.org. And I'll put that in the show notes. What other ways can we follow you or find more information about the Brennan Center and just all the great work that you're doing?
I'm on social media. I on X and Blue Sky and all the sites. So I certainly welcome followers. Our website is a tremendous resource. I also just would say, I mean, maybe my final plug will be for what some people call the legacy media. I would say, and not so much the national legacy media, but staying up to date with your local media if you can, like reading your local newspaper, listening to NPR, your local NPR station. I do think that there's a tremendous amount of excellent journalism happening that we collaborate on, and also get grilled, frankly, and get questioned and challenged by. So I encourage you to go to the Brennan Center, but I just also encourage people to seek out some of those traditional news sources because I think that there's a lot of really high quality journalism still happening, and it's important to stay informed that way. But then also follow me on X and Blue Sky.
Terrific. You might have just answered my last question, but a really excellent attorney once suggested that I ask this. We covered a lot, but is there anything important we haven't discussed that you'd like to add?
Well, if I ever have the privilege to do this again, I would love to talk about corruption. I would say that one of the issues that we're working on that we talked a lot about threats to the rule of law. We talked about a lot about sort of direct threats to voting. I think one of the troubling things that we are seeing, and I alluded to it some, is the kind of leveraging of government for personal self-enrichment. And I think that is actually a big part of the story of how we got here. And it's a story that no one side bears all the blame, although I do think this current president is escalating the sort of culture of impunity that we've seen.
Oof.
But that's an aspect I'd certainly love to delve in some other time, there are many other great guests you could have to talk about it.
No, you know what's funny is I did have some questions there, but speaks to how wonderful you've been as a guest. There's about 5 pages of questions that I didn't get to, but that was definitely. I heard this. You gave a talk in Colorado recently where you got into that. I
Yeah,
learned about that case in the '70s. I think Buckley v. Vallejo.
yeah.
That sort of the predicate to Citizens United. So lots to discuss there. Yeah, you absolutely have an open invitation to come back. This is a great conversation. Daniel, thank you so much for doing this, man.
Well, it was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow the show, write the review. Just actually write it. We could use more written reviews. It's really great. We really appreciate it. You can watch the conversations on YouTube. It's youtube.com/at politics and religion. And I am at Corey S. Nathan on all the socials at Corey S as in Sam Nathan at Corey S. Nathan on Substack and Twitter and all the thing, not actually TikTok. Anyway, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.